Sure, there are illegal drugs in Idaho, but how illegal should they be? It's a question being asked across the country and at the Idaho State House as the fentanyl crisis continues. Another question at the Capitol: how invasive is the Idaho Freedom Foundation? A conservative Republican former senator sat down to tell us what she sees. It's one of the oldest fights in the West: water. And 7 western states are now fighting over what's left of the Colorado River. It's not Idaho's problem right now, but with the weather trends we've seen over the past 20 years, it could be soon.
So our job here today is to decide how much crime we'll accept in our state.
Or to be more specific, what level of drug crimes are entirely unacceptable in our state. Imagine, if you will, a bill at the Idaho State House that finds the far right and the left standing together. Idaho law outlines mandatory minimum sentences for specific amounts of illegal narcotics. There was a discussion in the House Judiciary Rules and Administration Committee about House Bill 67 today. It's intended to amend that mandatory minimum law by adding fentanyl to a list that already includes marijuana, cocaine, meth, and heroin. The discussion went about 2.5 hours, and it was decided to hold it in committee. The interesting part of this hearing was hearing how conservative Republicans like Representatives Barbara Ehart and Heather Scott on the committee and Democratic lawmakers like Representative John Gannon and Colin Nash lined up on the same side of this. Committee members heard from several members of law enforcement who are in favor of this bill, hoping to get another weapon to fight against drug trafficking. But as Andrew Bartline found out, there could be victims on both sides of this argument.
Once you're tied up in a bad situation.
This was out of the prison a couple years in.
Amy Lawrence has seen firsthand.
I know she was doing a little because he kind of forced it on her.
How hard it can be to break free.
I've known Jade since she was 8 years old. Her family moved in next door to my house, and Mom would leave and not leave her with food or money to buy food, or the power would be off. This god-awful little place that she got, the ceilings were almost as low as here. It looked like you're in a bunker.
Tied up.
Mom's a partier, big time.
From one bad situation.
She just was with her boyfriend and her boyfriend's dad, who was selling.
On to the next.
Heroin.
The apartment had enough heroin to charge and convict Jade of drug trafficking without any proof of intent to sell. Under the same Idaho law, a judge was forced to sentence Jade to a mandatory minimum of 10 years in prison.
She's never had any legal issues before, no law problems with the law. There should be a case-by-case basis, definitely.
It's a sentiment shared among some lawmakers.
Which takes the power away from judges to impose sentences and gives that power to prosecutors.
Including Representative Colin Nash.
That's why we have judges there, and we should empower them to use their discretion on a case-by-case basis.
But in this case today, House Bill 67 aims to retie the knot, specifically by loosening the tie on heroin's mandatory minimum penalties, but most notably, by adding fentanyl to the list of qualifying substances.
We take the fentanyl crisis seriously, but we need to not jump to throwing people in prisons for decades and decades when the punishment might not fit the crime.
But it's the punishment's message,
deterring people from trafficking fentanyl,
that's garnered support from law enforcement in committee testimony.
We're looking at people who have trafficking amounts of weight and are killing our family members in this state.
The bill's language, however, does not require the state to quantify the exact amount of the illegal substance. This means 5 ounces of fentanyl and a pound of baking soda is criminalized as a full pound of illegal drugs in Idaho, which can quickly classify a personal use of drugs to a trafficking amount and be subject to a mandatory minimum.
Until we actually address that in state law, we'll be continually penalizing people without that parity in law.
Laws that tighten the knots to hold down Jade.
Even a couple of the officers out there says, I don't know why she's still here. She's not a problem. She's never been a problem.
Now, halfway through a 10-year sentence.
She's going to have a hard time getting back into society if she's doing 10 years because she doesn't know what's going on. So much has changed since she went in.
To be more specific about that mandatory minimum, 7 or more grams is what's needed to qualify, and that's what would change for heroin if this were to become law and if it added fentanyl. So 7 grams of pure fentanyl, law enforcement in testimony today said that's equivalent to 2,500 doses, or 3,500 doses, I should say. They say there are 500 doses in 1 gram of pure fentanyl. And the bill has brackets for mandatory minimum sentences, Brian. So 3 years. There are 3 years, 5 years, and 10 years. That's how it works out, those 3 different tiers. The lowest tier would be 7 grams. They're changing that because it used to be 2 grams for heroin. They're looking to up it. So loosening the reins on heroin a little bit, but then adding fentanyl to it as well. So it does 2 different things.
That's what I was going to ask. There's a lot of information, a lot of numbers you just threw at us, but to simplify this as best you can, we're loosening, we're tightening, we're adding. What is this? What exactly does this do?
Pretty much. So what is qualified for a mandatory minimum on heroin? It is loosening slightly and adding fentanyl to the list of drugs that qualify for a mandatory minimum sentence. Law enforcement say it's a deterrent and they like it. People who oppose it say that it's a little bit more nuanced than that because Idaho doesn't separate out mixtures. If you had a Coca-Cola bottle that had a pill of fentanyl in it, that whole substance of Coca-Cola is going to be considered fentanyl.
That's the weight.
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, we do know that this bill has been held. It needs some work, so it really is not doing much right now, but we'll wait and see if it gets brought back. All right. Thank you very much, Andrew.
I think you can ask anybody around this building. They'll change their ratings in the middle of a hearing. They'll send out text messages. They'll send out emails, encouraging and telling people how they should vote.
Legislators.
Yes. Why they're in committees.
About a year ago, we were talking about the Idaho Freedom Foundation and their increasing influence with legislators at the Idaho State House, to the detriment and impairment of the legislative process, according to many, including the President of the Senate, Senator Chuck Winder, as you just heard, last year. The IFF began in 2009 as a self-described free market think tank. These days, they say their mission is to, quote, make Idaho a laboratory of liberty. Well, when we were digging into this IFF influence last February, it wasn't easy to find too many lawmakers who felt free enough to speak to us on camera about the nonprofit or how they thought they might be a problem. They had too much on the line, they told us, and likely didn't want to be on the receiving end of a possible bullying campaign. Some of those legislators now have nothing to lose and are speaking out, like Senator Mary Souza from Coeur d'Alene. She's one of those. Senator Souza took office in 2015, and before that time, the conservative Republican says she would regularly contribute to the Coeur d'Alene Press, writing about politics and such. Well, she has returned to that role since giving up her Senate seat and declaring as a candidate for Secretary of State last spring, wanting to let Idahoans know what she saw inside the State House and outside it. She says she will name names, claiming to be candid without worrying about being canceled. For example, after not receiving the endorsement of the Kootenai County Republican Central Committee in her bid for that state office, she wrote she was relieved to not get that endorsement from a group which quickly forfeited their individual responsibilities, allowing themselves to be put in a political harness, she says, eyes and minds closed, and led down a shady path. Then on January 4th of this year, she called Brent Regan, the chairman of the KCRCC, the guy most dangerous to your voting freedom, calling him the inventor of a stealth method for manipulation of candidate information. Regan is also the chair of the IFF board, and Senator Souza promised to talk more about the IFF later in other columns, which she did a little more than a week ago. Now retired, Senator Souza wrote an opinion piece titled Fraudulent Freedom, the IFF Files, Part 1. In it, she touched on some of the things we reported on a year ago, the ratings of bills and lawmakers and the schoolyard intimidation tactics. Our first question for Senator Souza, why now?
Well, I've seen this about Idaho Freedom Foundation for a really long time, but I've also seen them change over the years in a way that I don't respect. And so I haven't been able to say that out loud because of my position in the Senate, but now I can explain what they're doing is wrong.
Senator Souza explained some of what was wrong in her uncanceled and unfiltered op-ed earlier this month, writing how the IFF typically scores bills before hearing much about them.
Grading bills before you've even heard the committee testimony or the floor debate is wrong. And it's really important that the process plays out because every bit of that process of evaluating that bill is important. It's important to all the different 35 districts in the state.
Those scores, Sousa says, carry a lot of influence. Too much influence, writing, "I have seen this list taped to the desk of some legislators in the House. No need to think for yourself and your district. Just vote the way you are told." You've seen these score sheets and these lists on people's desks.
I saw it with my own eyes. Yeah. And I actually saw one of the lists taped to the side of a computer screen for one of the senators a couple of years ago.
There are other groups that do rate bills, though.
But none of them grade you or bully you or push you, say bad things about you during campaigns if you don't vote the way they want you to. But the Freedom Foundation does all of those things.
About 5 years ago, Sousa wrote, she tried to talk to IFF leaders about their tactics and about how they were losing credibility with the Senate.
I suggested some changes that might give them better information, and they wanted nothing. They wanted none of it.
Why do you think that is?
Because that wasn't their goal. I believe their goal is just to control the legislature. They want to control the legislative process, and they are not interested in accurate information and full information about a bill. They're interested in grading it in a way that they can get more control. There are a lot of outside third-party groups that give legislators their opinion on bills. But to give a bill a score, that's one thing. But to give a legislator a score, that's a different thing altogether.
So did you ever grade highly on their scale?
I think my first scores were pretty decent. Never perfect, but pretty decent.
And they went down?
Well, they did go down. Of course they did. Everyone assumes that their grading methodology and the people applying that grading methodology are consistent and objective. And that's not true.
I know you have nothing to lose with this, which is why you kind of have this freedom to say what you want.
Yes.
But what's been the reaction?
Well, it's been pretty interesting, Brian, because I've gotten a lot of positive feedback, just a tremendous from people that I haven't heard from for years or don't know at all. And they are ecstatic that somebody is actually speaking out. The only thing I've gotten from the IFF crew is mostly silence. And then one or two or three of them have gotten on social media and called me names. If I'm getting personal insults, I like that because it means they can't address my issues, my policies. If they can't explain themselves or rebut anything that I have said, then it must all be correct and they have nothing to say except call me sour grapes or rhino or whatever the silly name of the day is.
So what does the IFF have to say about all this? Well, the same as they told us a year ago, and pretty much what Senator Sousa has heard, silence or nothing. Senator Sousa assured us these op-eds are not sour grapes. She willfully retired from the Senate, and she said she is being vocal, not out of spite, but out of a duty to educate the public, believing they need to know how this system at Idaho's State House is working or how it should work. At the end of her IFF essay, Senator Sousa says she has much more to expose, and she told us there will likely be several more chapters to share from her IFF files. Who should care who sits on a behind-the-scenes State House committee? Well, it depends on who you ask. Earlier this week, we broke down what's behind House Bill 68, which wants to eliminate the Joint Legislative Oversight Committee, or JLOC, and put the Office of Performance Evaluation under the Legislative Council. The OPE is, in short, a nonpartisan independent office of the legislature that evaluates whether state government programs and agencies are operating efficiently and cost-effectively and are achieving the intended results. Well, the bill's sponsor, Representative Megan Blanksma, argued this bill makes the oversight of OPE more efficient.
We're moving it from an appointed, unelected, not representative of the body, board, or council, committee, I'm losing it, committee, and then we're moving it to council, which is elected by the body and is the representative of the legislature. So this streamlines the process. We're getting rid of a middleman.
So cool, streamlining government, sounds great, right? Except House Minority Leader Ilana Rebel, who's also co-chair of that Joint Legislative Oversight Committee, argues it would be fixing something that isn't broken and take away some much-needed nonpartisan oversight.
I think we would really lose a lot of that credibility by moving it from a neutral system to a partisan system. I do not think it's appropriate to have the dominant party completely controlling the oversight of its own policies.
But her argument wasn't enough. After all, House Bill 68 passed the House today 57-13, right along party lines. The bill is now headed to the Senate.
We have 19th century law, 20th century infrastructure, 21st century climate. And those three things don't fit well together.
That would certainly make it a three-legged logjam of concerns for what is happening with the Colorado River right now. 7 states trying to figure out who will take the biggest hit and scale back how much water they pull from the Colorado system because, as most people know, that river and the reservoirs are historically and dangerously low. So what does what is happening in the southwestern part of the United States have to do with what is happening in the southern part of Idaho? Well, we're both technically in a desert, and we both use a similar system of storing and distributing water, and that system is looking to be a bit outdated. It's also put 7 states in a fight over water that really wasn't there in the first place, apparently. Sophia Bliss looked into this and learned these western states are working off water allocations which were set a century ago. So, Sophia, it appears those numbers in 1922, not the best ones to use.
That's right, Brian. I talked to Aaron Kuhn. He's a co-author of a book that in part explains the story of the Colorado River Compact. The Compact is the agreement that split the water up between the 7 western states. There were a team of engineers that were using technology that was relatively new for the time. River gauges collected data for about 20 years prior. Coincidentally, those 20 years the river gauges were in place were a very wet time period. So if the engineers only factored in the gauge data, they wouldn't be getting the full picture. Eugene LaRue was one of the engineers at the time. He looked at some of the other evidence and saw the Colorado River was subject to some long-scale droughts. When the time came, policymakers opted to not utilize LaRue's opinion. Kuhn says policymakers from the Bureau of Reclamation were focused on development and the potential upside.
They wanted to build Hoover Dam. And the more water that was in the river, the more we could divide up among the states, the more power it would produce, the bigger the benefits. So they wanted to provide a more positive, atmosphere. They were the optimists. They considered LaRue too much of a pessimist, but today, looking back, we consider him more of a realist.
Fast forward from 1922, the policies to spur growth worked. Communities in the West have grown significantly, and now it gets complicated trying to scale back some of that usage. Some people have senior water rights, others have junior water rights, but no matter how you slice up the allocations, the water was never there to begin with. It's like trying to split up a whole pie when you only have 3/4. And unfortunately, there may be even more stress on the water supply that is left.
And now what we've seen is that because of climate change, we're using more water than nature's providing. And that was okay when we were drawing the reservoirs down. And now after 25 years, those full reservoirs, like I say, are dangerously empty. And we have a crisis, and we have to figure out how to cut people back, cut farmers, cut cities back. And that's very difficult. And it's politically challenging, and it's legally challenging.
6 states agreed to an outline for cuts, but California is holding out. California has senior water rights and wants Arizona to give up more first. If the states can't agree, the federal government may step in with mandatory cuts across the board. Again, Brian, Colorado River is not in Idaho, but we collect our water in a similar way. We rely on the snow in the mountains in the winter, a slow melt in the spring, and a series of reservoirs. And the system as a whole only works when patterns continue as they have throughout history. And that's just not what we've seen for the past 20 years.
Yeah, we can kind of see that looking ahead, maybe that could happen here. Granted, we don't see as many things, people, farmers, ranchers pulling from our river system as maybe down there. Of course, California does a lot of that. But yeah, that's something we could see happening here for sure. Thanks, Sophia. All right, we're back. Busy afternoon on text messages coming into the 208. Let's get right to it. We got Bill in Boise who says, regarding the putting OP under Republican control, typical, putting the mouse in charge of the cheese, he says. Asking the Idaho GOP to police its own policies is like asking the U.S. House GOP to deal with Santos. They won't, says Jack in Boise. Again, that passed the House along party lines. The IFF flourishes because of fear. Fear by legislators that they will be labeled not a true conservative and thus lose at the polls. Let's change the polls. Support true statesmen, not just ours, says Toby. We've heard this story before, talking about that again. A year ago, we were talking about the IFF and their influence and that becoming a thing at the Idaho State House. If you don't want to do the time, don't do the crime. Doug coming in with that one today, which is, again, something we hear a lot. Don't mess with the illicit drugs. Expect to go to jail if you are caught. Seems like kind of a flat argument on that regard, but that's why they're trying to talk about the nuance of this with these bills. Thanks, Mary Souza, for validating what we have felt about IFF for years. We sure didn't elect them, said Terry. They elected the legislators, not the lobbyists. Weed definitely should not be on the same list as fentanyl and meth. That's insane. Idaho needs to legalize weed already and make some money off it. That's a take we've heard also a few times over the last few months. The IFF and its agenda gives me pause to think seriously as a lifelong conservative Republican to vote for Democratic candidates. The far right is way out in la-la land for my liking, says Bill J. And this one, I'm not sure who this question is, but what happens if you have 8 grams of heroin that is only 10% pure? I don't know. I'm not Walter White. I don't know the answer to these things. We'll see you tomorrow.